Today is 44 days since the incursion of Hamas into Israel. On this screen, you will see the names of 10 beautiful lost souls whose lives have been taken from us during this war, whose memories will never be forgotten. And while you are privately dedicating your learning, I invite you to take a moment to meditate on the names before you. And please feel free to write your own dedications in the chat, as is our custom when learning. Every class throughout this whole month, we have listed 10 individuals whose names we like to and want you to be able to meditate and share in that with us. Because we have a lot of people in the Zoom room today, we will have mute everybody, as Adi said. I'd like to invite you to write all of your questions into the chat. I'll get to as many as I possibly can and group them according to topic. So if I don't get to a question immediately, it will probably because I'm saving it to another time when I know Daniella is going to be speaking on that particular question or that particular subject. And we will also, in addition to breaking between segments for questions, we'll also leave time at the end of the presentation for more questions. So about Daniella. Daniella is a licensed tour guide in Israel and an educator par excellence, as anyone here who has traveled with us and her already knows. Apart from working with Melton in Israel, she also works with AIPAC Geopolitical Missions, Reality of Israel, Schusterman Foundation, the Jerusalem Press Club, ITREC, and the adult group of March of the Living, and many, many, many more really high-level organizations. Her background is in social work. She's a licensed therapist and an educator, working predominantly in her area of therapy with special education, youth and families, as well as at-risk youth in the social periphery of Israel. Daniella served as a nature guide in the IDF, and if you have joined us on our, or will join us on our olive vine and palette tour in Israel, you'll know just how amazing she is at identifying almost every living plant, flower, and species we encounter. In addition to that, her areas of specialty include geopolitics, archaeology, history, cultures, Jewish tradition, and world religions. Her BA is in geography and her MA in clinic, and she has an MA in clinical social work, both from the Hebrew University, and she has a license. She's obviously a licensed tour guide from the Ministry of Tourism. So without further ado, I'm going to show you, give you I'm going to share with you the outline and how we'll be breaking the class down today. The first section is what is Gaza, and that will deal with the occupation, Egyptian occupation, current infrastructure, and how they came to be in charge and so on. And then we'll break for questions. The next segment will be policy and relationships between Hamas and Israel, what it's like to live with the threat of Hamas, the American-Israel relationship, Iran-Russia relationship. And we'll take a break after that for our next segment, the greater picture, where we'll look at the Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, safe spaces in Gaza, European and global coordination effort. And then we will end with changes, mood, and silver linings, and that will be where we end. And when we say silver linings, clearly there's no silver lining to what we're seeing right now, but we are seeing a lot of support in the Jewish community. We ourselves have a solidarity mission going in January. Daniella, I'm hoping, will be a part of that with us as the numbers continue to grow. And I will share more information about our solidarity mission to Israel at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, Daniella, I am passing over to you.
Thank you, Andrea. It's always great to see you, and I wish that we'd met in happier circumstances. So without further ado, I suggest we start. I'll start with the self-disclosure. I've been guiding Israel and guiding Gaza and guiding along the border with Gaza for quite a few years now. And in the past few years, we've been talking about the same, what we call the conception of life along Gaza and the containment conception. And the events that took place 6.5 weeks ago have changed the way changed the way most of us view that life, with the understanding that what was before October 7th will not be the same again. And so a lot of what we're about to talk right now is that understanding, which has come in the past 6 weeks, and some of it is still shaped today. Every day there's more evidence, there's more heartbreaking testimonials that are brought forward, and we know more about what happened that day. And even some of what I wrote 5 weeks ago or 4 weeks ago when I first started presenting this presentation is being changed by some of the evidence brought forward on a daily basis, including today, which I you'll see in a minute. New evidence that I had to put into today's slideshow. With the help of Adi, thank you for assisting in all the technicalities of today. We're going to start presenting the slideshow. And I started with Israel at War, my first slideshow, showing a house of a family. That's and the understanding that this war took place inside communities for the first time in over 50, some would argue 75 years. This was a war fought in Israeli territory, which was primarily against Israeli citizens. And what happened was that over 3,000 very highly trained Hamas operatives, Hamas terrorists, armed to the teeth with RPGs and mortar shells and grenades and very sophisticated materials, weapons, and maps of the communities that they broke into, including information about where the first responsive unit holds its guns, for instance, so that they can get to them before the first response unit barges into Israel in 30 different locations. And as they barge into Israel under a blanket of over 3,000 missiles that are fired in a matter of few hours, they take Israel in surprise. And they focus on 23 civilian communities. I'm sure you've heard the names, Be'eri, Kfar Aza, Nachal Oz, Nir Oz, but there are many, many, many more that we haven't heard about that were attacked that day. And they attack over 12 military outposts. And the estimation today is that they happen upon a peace festival, a music peace festival celebrated out in the open that night, which started at 3 a.m. And they get there right at sunrise, 6:30 in the morning when everyone's dancing, applauding the sun. That peace festival had over 4,000 people celebrating. 364 are murdered in that event. At the end of that day, or at the end of the next day, we're also witnessing a massive, massive evacuation of citizens, civilians, from the south and later from the north of Israel. This all unfolds within a very short amount of time, within about the first 24 hours of shock, while they're still fighting a day later, sometimes 2 days later, still fighting on Israeli territory, in Israeli soil, inside these communities, with terrorists that hold their grounds for over 24 hours. This is all the results of the first 24 hours of shock. And that's slide number 1. It's important to understand what Gaza is. And we talk about the Gaza Strip, we're talking about a long, artificially designed strip, which was supposed to be, in the very beginning, part of the Arab state, a partition plan. That's our next slide. We'll get to it. Today, it has 2.2 million people. It's a very young community. It's 18 is the median age there. It's got a border with Israel. It's got a border with the sea, and it's got a border with Egypt in the south. It was occupied and ruled by Egypt first. Between 1948 and 1967, those were very formative years during which a lot of the problems of Gaza were created, a lot of the very divisive issues. It was later occupied again by Israel in 1967. Israel withdrew in 1994 to some extent, and entirely in 2005 in the disengagement, including pulling out every single man, woman, soldier, and grave. We pulled out our deceased that were buried there, so that there'll be no claim against Israel regarding its occupation of the Gaza Strip. And shortly after that, Hamas took over. So that's the slide we were looking at right now. You can see the size of the Gaza Strip, and also it's the fact that it's disconnected from the rest of the Palestinian population in the West Bank. Moving into the next slide, we're looking at the origins of Gaza, or the origins of the Gaza problem, which is the partition plan. The partition plan devised by the United Nations to solve a problem of one land and two people feuding over. This plan was overwhelmingly accepted by the Jewish people around the world and in Israel under David Ben-Gurion, and was overwhelmingly rejected by the Arab nations and the local Palestinians in the land of Israel, who said no. This is a word we'd hear later over and over again in Khartoum: no to recognition of Israel's claim over any part of the land, no to a state called Israel, and no to Jewish dominance or a Jewish state in what they see as, from the river to the sea, a slogan we'll hear over and over, an entirely Palestinian land with no room for any Jews on any part of it. And as they reject that plan, they will open war. And the results of that war are the creation of a Gaza Strip, of an area which will be taken by Egypt in the south of Israel, in the southern coastline of Israel, and ruled by Egypt for 19 years. And as they rule that land, they will not do anything to develop it. They will not allow any of the Palestinians, most of whom are refugees of that war that end up in that area, to become citizens in Egypt. They will not receive any civil rights, and they will do nothing to develop the land for the benefit of its people. The contrary, they will start something called the perpetuation of the refugee problem, another slide we'll talk about soon, and they'll use those people to send them over and over to Israel, telling them your homes are actually there, and they'll start something called the Fedayeen movement, which is the terror attacks of Gazans from Gaza towards the Israeli population, which 75 years ago, 80 years ago, and today is centered everywhere along its borders, along Israel's borders, including along the border with Gaza. And so these communities, Be'eri and Kfar Aza, have known terror 75 years ago. And in that sense, it's not a new occurrence to them. It's just that the magnitude and the barbarity of the events of October 7th were definitely unfathomable to most of us. In 1967, Israel, during the Six-Day War, along with the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, will take over the Gaza Strip in order to control it and stop the terror. The idea is we can't stop it if we're not there. And at that point, Israel will take over the Strip. And in the next slide, we can see how that develops. And so Israel and Gaza, Israel took it shortly in the Sinai campaign, then withdrew. Then in 1967, in the Six-Day War, it takes it with the idea that in order to stop the terror, we have to control it. In the Oslo peace process, the first city that's transferred for Palestinian self-government power, along with Jericho, is actually Gaza. Yasser Arafat arrives shortly after that, and from 1994, the city of Gaza is under complete Palestinian control. And in 2005, Israel will remove all of its civilians and military outposts in what's known as the disengagement. And from that point on, in the eyes of the world, Israel is no longer an occupier. Israel, there are no settlements. There is no international beef or grief between the Gaza Strip and the state of Israel. 2 years after Israel removes all of its forces, Hamas will take control of Gaza, and it will do so in a military coup, literally overthrowing the regime, the Palestinian Authority, which is the authority designed by peace with Israel to control, and throwing people off rooftops and executing 188 of the members of the Palestinian Authority in the streets. Yeah, it's we're moving on to the next slide. What is Hamas? And I think that many of us, myself included, have forgotten what Hamas really is and what its charter represents. Hamas wrote its charter in 1988, and it was very clear about what it is and what it is stating upon itself, what it claims to be. The Islamic resistance movement strives to raise the banner of Allah over every inch of Palestine, every inch from the river to the sea. There is no room for any Jewish land, and what they see is their land entirely. It started as an anti-PLO, started in 1988 for a reason. That's the year when Israel starts recognizing the Palestinian PLO, the secular regime, the secular group of people led by Yasser Arafat, which Israel strikes and will eventually lead towards a peace agreement with. And Hamas is created as an opposition, saying, if there ever is a Palestine, it has to be ruled by Sharia. It has to be ruled by the religious fundamentalist view of Islam, and not by secular moderates who will involve Christians into the PLO, for instance. It is an anti-normalization or anti-recognition of Israel. The idea of no, no, no. We do not recognize Israel. We do not communicate with it. We do not even call it Israel. We call it the Zionist entity. We call it the regime. We call it the occupying force. We call it the occupied area of Palestine, rather than naming it by its name. It's a grassroots program. It started in mosques. It started in soup kitchens. It started providing people with food and education. It said, we'll take your kids and we'll give them a good education and you won't have to worry about them. But the education they gave them, well, we'll see soon. And it starts as a small terror organization with separate cells at first. Only later, in the next slide, we'll see what it grows into. And so we're moving on to the next slide. No to any kind of territorial solution with Israel. And that's a very, very large part of their ideology. There is no solution for the Palestinian question except through jihad. Once again, I'm back to the covenant of Hamas. It is the duty of the followers of other religions to stop disputing the sovereignty of Islam in this region, because the day these followers should take over, there will be nothing but carnage, displacement, and terror. These are words chosen by them, which so many of us have chosen to, I think, look away from in the course of the last 3-4 years. The pictures we're looking at, that's a suicide bomber in a bus, number 18 in Jerusalem, 1995. The picture below, 2002, it's Seder night, Passover, when a suicide bomber walks into the Park Hotel in Netanya and blows himself up in the middle of Seder night, killing 39 Israelis. The Seder plates are still on the table here as they're trying to clean off the blood. This event brought Israel to reinvade the Palestinian Authority, to reinvade the territories, the West Bank, and to clear out Hamas. And the blow that Hamas took during the Second Intifada after the Park Hotel Seder Night Terror Act was so severe that they were reduced to very, very little more than anything in the West Bank. Well, that will eventually lead them to seek their power elsewhere in Gaza. The idea is to weaken the PLO and the peace process by attacking Israel. Israel will turn on the PLO and say, we have a peace agreement with you. Why are there terrorists blowing themselves up in our cafes, markets, buses? In essence, they were successful. They weakened our assurances and our peace process by creating an opposition to the PLO and by creating terror. And so the series of suicide attacks in the 90s and the 2000s until 2005, and they have a very complicated relationship with the Palestinian Authority. Like I said, there were times of peace. And ever since 2007, ever since a very, very bloody dispute in Gaza, which took the lives of Palestinian Authority, they've been in a source of beef, of internal Palestinian dispute. I'm sorry if I'm talking a little fast. Let's see what else we have going. It's important to understand and to address the anti-Semitism at the roots of Hamas. This, again, is from the Charter. The Zionist plan is limitless. After Palestine, they aspire to extend from the Niles to the Euphrates. Their plan is embodied in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is a myth, a Soviet anti-Semitic slur designed in the 1920s. You can see a photo of the cover of one of those editions. The day of judgment will not come until Muslims fight the Jews, killing all Jews. When the Jew will hide behind the stones and the trees. I don't know if you've been hearing this hadith. It's an oral teaching. It's not in the Quran. Many Muslims will choose to avoid addressing it because they realize just how terrible it is. But it is mentioned in the declaration, the Charter of Hamas, in black and white. There is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. And so that's a little bit about what they're rooted in. This is a fundamentalist, jihadic, anti-Semitic group, which is openly talking about killing all Jews. It is not anti-Israel as it is anti-Jewish, and eradicating any form of Jew from what they see as perceived as from the river to the sea, the entire land of Palestine. And no to any legitimation or any peace process. It will only lead, remember, to carnage and terror. If we can see the next slide. Hamas in Gaza. This is a picture of a trial. Hamas pulls somebody off the street. They're holding him away from his wife. He's pulled in the street. He's charged with collaborating with Israel, and he's shot later that day in the street with no trial. This is the kind of regime. And notice that the people, the police, the regime in Gaza, which is picking him up, is not even wearing, open-faced uniform. They're still behaving, in essence, like a terror organization ever since they took control of Gaza. And they're playing a double game. On the one hand, they take money and aid from the United Nations, from European unity, from America, money that's supposed to pour into the very deprived people of Gaza. And they take it as a regime. And on the other hand, they act like a terror organization in the night. Their funding comes mostly from foreign aid, billions of dollars that have poured into Gaza. It is estimated that $250 million, $250 million, were poured only into the underground city of the tunnels, the assault tunnels and the defense tunnels, which we'll get a glimpse of in a few slides. Between 2006 and 2023, this is a research that came out on October 5th, 2 days before the massacre. The wages in Gaza were cut down in half, from $2,500 a year. That's the annual average wage in Gaza, to $12.60. In the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, the wages have doubled. They're still very low, but they doubled from 25 to just under 5,000. So this is what happens when Hamas takes control. The quality of life goes down, blood goes up. It's a blood cult. And the foreign aid money that's pouring in has no trickle-down effect. We're seeing it in the average wages. People's lives are not getting better, they're getting worse. Why is that? Because most of the money in the next slide, if we can take a look at it, goes into terror. And here's a picture of the EU, United Nations program of water pipes, of a desalination pipe for the benefit of the people of Gaza. And this is a picture of Hamas operatives. Again, their faces are covered as they're pulling out those pipes. And anybody has any idea what they're using them for? This is a rhetorical question. You're all on mute. They're cutting them down to make more rockets. They're using everything they can to make rockets. And since there's a siege on what goes into the Gaza Strip, because they're using everything they can to fire at us, they're cutting off signposts in the streets, and they're cutting out water pipes placed for the benefit of people in Gaza. The refugee percentage in Gaza is 75%. We'll talk about that in a minute. Hamas has taken control over everything. It is the government, which means that they're in charge of welfare, of health, of education. They're the teachers of these people, of a society that is so young. Any foreign aid has to go through Hamas. Literally, the money has to go through the channels of Hamas. Otherwise, it won't take the money, which means that they control, and 90%, 99% of every dollar or euro that is brought into the Palestinian, into Gaza, for water or for health or for food guarantees, will probably be poured into rockets fired at us. In that sense, it's a return on investment in a bad way. Over 80% of the population is on aid programs. And there's an over 50% of the population is unemployed. That number will go drastically high. I'll explain in the next slide. And it's ruled by Sharia law, which means in a similar way to the Taliban in Afghanistan, to Iran, the law of the land is their interpretation of Islam. I'm not saying it's the law of Islam. There are many countries that rule by Islam, not the way Hamas sees it. They will execute LGBTQs without even condemning them in that sense. They will go down on women if they're not seen as modest. They have modesty programs for women in a similar way to Iran. This is really the worst version of Islam out there, or the worst jihad interpretation of Islam possible. Thanks, Adi. Let's move on to the next one. Refugees. Why is Gaza different from the West Bank, for instance? If you look at the picture I've put over here of refugee percentage or refugee camps throughout the world, you can see that there are a lot of Palestinian refugees. I'm talking about 1948. The Palestinian refugees are refugees from the war they started in 1948, at the end of which they were displaced from different areas, which became the land of Israel, from Jaffa, from Haifa, from Acre, from West Jerusalem. In a similar way that Jews were refugees from their lands in Arab countries, from Morocco and from Tunisia. And you can see that the refugee camps in Jordan, in Syria, and Lebanon, but the volume of refugee camps in Gaza is the highest in the world. So there are more refugees in Gaza in percentage and in volume, in absolute numbers, than anywhere else in the world. Of the 2.2 million people living in Gaza today, 75% are recognized as refugees from 1948, which means that a baby that is born today in Gaza is recognized as a refugee from 1948. How does that make sense? They're the only people in the world which have a different refugee status. The United Nations acknowledges refugees as people who are displaced by war, their children born the next day or the day after that in a different country. In Turkey, if you're displaced from Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria in the past 2 decades, are no longer refugees. They can become citizens of the new land, they can become residents, but the refugee status, which allows you work, food, welfare, healthcare for life, will only be given to the displaced person. In the Palestinian case, they are the only people in the world which have a separate but equal refugee program called UNRWA, which allows every descendant of a refugee from 1948, of a refugee male from 1948, to be acknowledged as a refugee from 1948, a Palestinian refugee. Why is this such an issue? Because it means if you've ever been to a Palestinian refugee camp I've been to a few in Ramallah, or this is from Aida, from Bethlehem, which I visited a few years ago. The symbol of every refugee camp, the literal gate that you drive through to go into, is a key. And the key represents their yearning to return to their homes, to their lands, from the river to the sea, remember, in Israel proper. Meaning they don't actually live in Aida, they don't actually live in Gaza. It's just a temporary home for them because their home is really elsewhere, which means that they're not connected to where they are. They have no reason to ever engage, to ever develop, to ever settle in. And they have every reason to hate and actively terrorize or strive to return by means of war to where they feel they were deprived of, the land beyond the border, the land beyond the fence. And this is really important to understand because we've been seeing Hamas marching people to the fence with Israel in the return marches. Do you remember those marches? 2019, 2020, these peaceful events that were really not peaceful. They were everything but peaceful. The return marches, and people kept asking, what will happen if Israel will just allow these people to peacefully march into Israel and take down its borders? Well, October 7th gave us a glimpse into what will happen if that amount of people march through the border that Israel placed to protect itself. The refugee issue is a win-win for Arab states. They don't have to acknowledge or accept Palestinians as citizens. They don't have to give them any civil rights to invest in them, with the exception of Jordan, as the only country that actually accepted Palestinians between 1948 and 1977 and gave them rights. Every other Arab country in the world never accepted until today Palestinian refugees and gave them civil rights. They get to pressure Israel through the UN. Look at these poor refugees from 1948. There are 8 million of them today. And they get to push people to fight against Israel. It's an endless supply of people who have a beef with Israel, who feel that they were born into deprivation, into a refugee status. And that's the situation today in Gaza. You can see pictures here of kids. This is an end of the year school play in Khan Yunis in a refugee camp. Look at the parents behind. They're chatting. They're catching up. Who did what? There's a woman in niqab here with only her eyes showing. And what's on stage are kids performing a show of 2 Hamas terrorists capturing an Israeli soldier. Later, they will execute him on stage. The picture on the right is what looks like an 8 or 9-year-old holding an anti-tank missile on his shoulder. And the fact that Hamas has been educating the Palestinian kids for the past 20 years is one way of understanding how this came to be. How does a young Palestinian person perform the atrocities, which I'm not even going to go into explaining to you, which happened on the 7th, which are no short of Nazi massacre and torture. How does this happen? Because for 20 years, they've been indoctrinated by monsters. In a way, if Adi can play this video now, you can understand. And this is a video filmed 2 years ago in a summer camp of Hamas, where people are proudly talking about.
They call them the Pioneers of Liberation and the Sword of Jerusalem summer camps, run by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. These videos, posted by Memory, the Middle East Media Research Institute, show what the youth of Gaza are doing this summer.
We did not come here to enjoy ourselves or to play or anything like that. We came with our souls, our blood, our martyrs, and are wounded to sacrifice ourselves for Palestine and for our people.
This promotional video urges students from primary school, high school, and college to participate. In the camp, target practice involves AK-47s, anti-tank weapons, and video simulations.
So that in the next phase, Allah willing, these boys will be able to confront the plundering enemy and disfigure its face in the next war.
In May, Hamas and Islamic Jihad called the 11-day war with Israel the sword of Jerusalem. Their goal, preparing the next generation for the next war.
We say to the enemy, these children picked up these weapons, and we trained them how to use them, as well as how to take security measures, so that they will follow in the footsteps of their fathers and take up arms, Allah willing.
I chose to spend my vacation in the Pioneers of Liberation summer camp in order to continue the path of my father, the martyred commander Walid Shamala Abu Bilal, and in order to strengthen our determination and to liberate Jerusalem, Allah willing.
These young men and boys learn anti-Semitism at an early age.
We asked Hitler why he left some of you alive. He did so in order to show us how wicked you are. We will come to you from under the ground and hammer fear into your hearts, and above the ground we will tear your bodies apart with our rockets. Scram into the shelters, you mice, you sons of a Jewish woman.
Memory has been monitoring these summer camps.
Okay, we're going to stop over here. I think that was a terrible example of what happens when almost a Nazi ideology. This is to me is like walking through Yad Vashem, through the first room, when they talk about how it came to be that Nazis performed these things. That the SS groups went in as the Einsatzgruppe and killed people and murdered babies, and it followed a whole decade of indoctrination of Nazism to the youth of Germany. And what we're looking at is a generation, is 20 years of Nazi ideology in Gaza, which manifested itself in the events of October 7th by these people. Are we going back now?
We're going to take some questions before we move into the next segment. So I'm going to group a couple. So the first question, why didn't Egypt take back the Gaza Strip when they signed a peace treaty with Israel? And is there a natural geographic boundary to Gaza? If not, why is its boundary where it is today?
Okay, I'll answer the second question first. The boundaries are the way they were drafted with the ceasefire arrangements in Rhodes, 1949. So at that point between Israel and Egypt, where our forces stood and where their forces stood, a line was drawn. In some cases, it was drawn with a green pencil along the border, which is why we call it the Green Line until today, because of the color of the pencil used to draw it. And that would mark the outline of the internationally acknowledged borders between Israel and Gaza, Israel and the West Bank, Israel and Lebanon, for instance, the purple line, until today. It is not a natural border in the sense that it does not follow any natural formation, a mountain, a river like the Jordan River, Rift Valley. It just marks where the borders, where the deployment of the soldiers were on the event of March 1949. Why did Egypt not want it back? By the time Israel had taken over Gaza from Egypt, by the time Sadat wishes for a peace agreement with Israel, between Israel and Egypt, sees Gaza as what it is, a hornet's nest, full of Muslim extremism and fundamentalism, a jihadic approach, which is unwavering. And Sadat, I think, rightfully understands he does not want to be in charge of that hornet's nest. This is the same kind of ideology which will eventually get Sadat killed for signing a peace agreement with Israel.
Thank you. Two questions also similar. I thought Hamas was elected by the people, not so. And Hamas won, and the next question, Hamas won an election for a Palestinian legislature in 2006. It beat Fatah by about 44 to 41%. But the way the election law worked, this narrow margin translated into a big majority in the legislature.
Yeah, the last time the Palestinian Authority went to elections was in 2006. And as a surprise, and this I think surprised everyone, including the Americans who were very much in favor of democratizing the system, Hamas at the time, or still today, saw its political branch as separate from its practical terrorist branch. And in the eyes of many in the world, its political branch was seen as a separate and a legitimate force. And it ran for power in the Palestinian Authority. And it didn't run for president, but it ran for the parliament, for the legislative position, and they won a majority. They won a majority of 66 seats. Like you said, it was marginal. It was a little bit over 7 or 8% of points, but it gave them the majority of seats, and it gave them also a claim over the throne of Abbas, of Shtaye, of the prime minister. And with these results shocking everyone in the world, including Israel and America, the world, Israel, America, Europe had put a lot of pressure on the Palestinian Authority, saying, if you're forming a government with Hamas, we can no longer be in business with you because Hamas is a terror organization. And the results of those elections were canceled. The Palestinian Authority was not willing to waiver the aid and the recognition the world was giving it by handing over power to Hamas. And in many sense, that's what led eventually Hamas to take over Gaza, realizing that it will not be given a plate at the table in the West Bank, in Ramallah. It would not be received in Ramallah in the parliament, the Muqata'a. It strived to take over Gaza. There have not been elections ever since in the Palestinian Authority. We say that Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, is on his 18th year of a 4-year term.
Thank you. I have two also similar questions here. Can you speak to the role of the UN in perpetuating and fueling the Palestinian refugee issue? And why does the US continue to fund UNRWA when they know they are indoctrinating children in the schools in Gaza to hate Jews and to learn that terrorism is their only future?
The United Nations has agreed to the creation of UNRWA in perpetuity, and I don't think it can change it now. UNRWA was created back in the 50s, when the Arabs had a lot of power and oil power and hands in the United Nations. And today, I don't think the United Nations will be able to change that decision. Having said that, they're definitely a challenge. We're seeing the deployment of forces. Rockets are being fired out of UNRWA schools. As we speak, there were rockets fired towards my home at 6:02 today, just 2 hours ago. We had to go into safe rooms because there were rockets fired and there was a siren. And they're using UNRWA schools and they're using hospitals to send those rockets out. And the world knows about this, and the United Nations know about this. But the United Nations, which in some cases is honestly trying to help and promote life in Gaza and to help the people there, realize that the only way for them to gain any access to the people in Gaza and to be on the ground and to give them support and healthcare is through Hamas and is through UNRWA, which Hamas controls on the grounds. All of the employees of UNRWA in Gaza are paid by Hamas or are deployed by Hamas. If we were to see a video that was broadcasted yesterday by the IDF, we'd see that Hamas militants are marching hostages into the Al-Shifa hospital while there are doctors around. And the doctors are seeing this happen and they can't stop it from happening. Some of those doctors might be UN doctors, volunteers, although most of them by now are out of Gaza. There's not much they can do about Hamas as long as they want to continue to be effective in some way to the Palestinians. Why America continues to aid and to send aid is a matter of foreign policy, American foreign policy. I have a hard time answering that question. But it is a good question. And I think, like I started saying today, what was before October 7th will not be the same anymore. I've heard a senator speak of this. I've heard the House committee speaker talk of this. It will not be done. Hopefully by then Hamas, or at least the infrastructure of Hamas, will not be in control of Gaza. And the channels, the arrangements for aid in Gaza will not be the same anymore.
One more question. Is it true that 75% of Palestinians are supporting Hamas?
So that's a good question, because when you're looking at surveys of, who are you likely to vote for, up until a few months ago, Hamas was getting a majority vote, and it was getting majority vote out of lack of confidence and anger with the Palestinian Authority, which is seen as extremely corrupt, completely obsessed with money. If I drive into Ramallah every now and then, and the contrast between the refugee camps and the Bel Air style villas of the regime, of the 85, 90-year-old, old school people from Tunisia, the PLO, is unbelievable. And there's no room for young people. There's no room for innovation. There's no room even for moderates in that sense. And the entire population is becoming more and more extreme. And so the vote for Hamas is usually a vote of lack of confidence for the Palestinian Authority, rather than people in Ramallah
Yes.
wanting Sharia law enforced on them in Ramallah. But that is an issue. It definitely is an issue. Hamas is seen as, or at least was, and we're seeing a change now, as an organization which gets things done. If so many Palestinians are obsessed with the question of prisoners in Israeli prisons, Hamas got 1,027 Palestinians out of jail in return for one Israeli soldier, Gilad Shalit, in 2011, which is something the Palestinian Authority wasn't able to achieve. And so they're seen as people which managed to deal with Israel, to get Israel to do things rather than the Palestinian Authority, which is seen as very corrupt and almost irrelevant. I'm saying that things have changed. On October 5th, a survey showed up and was actually broadcasted by Khalil Shkaki, who was a very good Palestinian surveyor. He's considered very reliable, and he showed for the first time in many years lack of support to Hamas. He showed predominantly people tired with Hamas. They are now seeing Hamas as corrupt. They're looking at the Hamas leaders in Qatar and in Turkey who are living in really comfortable homes while the population in Gaza is suffocated. They're looking at the wages I showed you earlier that are cut by half. They're looking at foreign aid that's not making it in. They're looking at a futile war against Israel that's not moving anywhere. Israel is just becoming stronger, building more defense mechanisms against the Palestinian aggression from Gaza. And for the first time in many, many years, we have seen on October 5th, some will say that the timing of October 7th was in some way also because of this survey that came out 2 days earlier. We're seeing a shift in Palestinian sentiment towards Hamas.
Okay, I think so. We have another question about who controls the Rafah crossing with Egypt, but I think you might be getting to that in another section. So Adi, I think we may want to put the presentation back up, and we will continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adriana. Okay. Well, Israel is seen in the eyes of the world as responsible for what goes in Gaza, even though it withdrew from Gaza, and Gaza has been under complete different control. It is responsible in the sense that Israel still aids Gaza. 22,000 workers in Israel up to October 7th. Unfortunately, we know that some of those workers were actually Hamas members that came into Israel as camouflage as workers and would go back every day giving information about the whereabouts of bases and civilians. They would go into communities working in the fields, and some of those people infiltrated on October 7th and actually walked with the Hamas members, telling them which family has guns where each person lives. But Israel allowed workers into its fields up until October 7th. Israel supplies 30 to 50% of electricity to Gaza and 10% of water. Over 1,000 Gazans, mostly children, are treated in Israel, even today as we speak, mostly in an oncological advanced treatment. These are pro bono treatments. And many Israelis, myself included, drive Palestinian children from the checkpoints. I drive it from the checkpoint near my home in Na'alim to Israeli hospitals to allow them access to advanced medical supplies. The lady in the picture here, Vivian Silver, was one of the leaders of Women Wage Peace and the Road Rage Recovery, which is where I also volunteered. She was presumed kidnapped, and her body was identified 3 days ago. She was brought to burial 2 days ago. She is a member of the Be'eri community, and she and so many people around her, including Yocheved Lifshitz, who was one of the hostages, was actually released. We're living along the border and constantly hoping for peace. They put up a wall facing Gaza that says "Path to Peace," with little pieces of ceramics that you'd stick on them. So the people in these communities were actually some of the most peace-seeking people I'd ever met in my life, and we would come there and talk about what it's like to live under, shells and rockets, and all they could talk about is the day when the wall can be removed and they could meet their friends from the other side. And these were the communities that were massacred. Because to Hamas, they are everything Hamas hates. They are the idea of coexistence and legitimacy and peace. And in the eyes of Hamas, there can be no peace and there can be no coexistence. Let's move over to the next one. We have a lot to cover. And I noticed that in the past 20 years, Hamas has been taking in arms through the sea and through attack tunnels like the one we're seeing here. This is what Israel confiscated off one ship called the Carrying A, 50 tons of ammunition. And so Israel has been building up a line of defense. Yeah, Vivian Silver, a line of defense along its borders and in the sea. This line was supposed to be impregnable. We realized that it's not so, and that it was quite easy for them to cross through it. This cost $1 billion, this line of defense. Israel has been allowing Gazans to cross into. Let's move over to the next one. Israel has been living under rockets for the past 20 years, ever since 2002. The rockets at first would reach only the communities around what we call the envelope of Gaza, but today the mortar range of rockets can reach every corner in the country. Literally almost every corner of the country, they've launched towards Eilat, they've launched towards the Galilee. And you can see pictures of what kids do in Sderot when they have only 15 seconds and they can't get to a safe room, so they lie on the floor and they cover their heads. You can see a picture from Sderot, which was the most targeted city because it's 2 miles away from Gaza. And this is a playground. It's a fortified playground made out of concrete so that kids can play and still feel safe and still get to a safe room, which is the caterpillar itself. It's a play caterpillar. As a result of that, Israel came up with the American-Israeli project of the Iron Dome, which we are incredibly thankful for. It has made life possible along the border under the rockets. We're looking at 50,000 rockets that were launched towards Israel in the past 20 years. Could you imagine even living under a few dozens in America? 50,000 rockets were launched out of Gaza in the past 2 decades. On the morning of October 7th alone, 3,000 rockets were there to camouflage or to mask that land invasion. 550 rockets misfired into Gaza, killing hundreds of people, including in the Indonesian hospital itself, which was later blamed on Israel, but this was a misfiring. Let's look at the next slide. Iron Dome, over 90% accuracy in the past few rounds. It is an incredible achievement, an expensive one which we are unbelievably thankful to the American people, to you guys, for developing and for restocking. In May 2022, we needed a restocking of it, and Congress allowed for it. And it is what allows people to sleep at nights, knowing that even if they get to a safe room in time, their house might be taken out by a rocket. With a 90% accuracy rate, look at this incredible picture. We know that our skies are safer. And it also saves Palestinian lives, because with fewer people being killed on the Israeli side, there's less retribution in that sense. Moving on to the next one, how this happened. And I want to say a word about the conception. In the past 2 years, we were all under the perception in the past 2 rounds of violence, of rockets being fired towards Israel in May 2022 and May 2023, Hamas did not take part. They sat still while the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PIJ, was the force behind the firing of the rockets. And Hamas has been investing in the Gazan people, has been taking Qatari money, and did not engage in Israel, against Israel. And so the conception was Hamas has matured into a regime. It is now busy with sewage and education, and it is busy with the people in Gaza. It cares about the people in Gaza. And it was very comfortable for us to project some of our values and say, now that they've matured into the, where you sit is where you stand. Now that they've become the regime, they actually care about the people, and they don't want to drag Israel into another big campaign with a land invasion. And this proved as a catastrophic mistake. Adi, if you could play the next clip. This is the day after. On October 8th, a general of Hamas, Ali Taha, is on Russian Arab TV talking about the attack.
عدد محدود من قيادة حماس يعرف أقل من أصابع اليد الذين كانوا يعرفون عن العملية وتوقيتها. وحماس سلوكها في السنتين الماضيات انه عقلاني وما بتدخل في حروب وما وقفت مع الجهاد الاسلامي في معركته السابقه.
لكن هاي كانت ضمن استراتيجيه
طبعا
من اجل تحضير
انه
لهذه
حماس
العملية.
مشغوله بالحكومه في غزه وبدها تدير بالها على 2.5 مليون فلسطيني وملتهيه وخلص تركت المقاومه، لكن حماس من تحت الطاوله كانت تحضر لهذه العمليه الكبيره، وصواريخ المقاومه اليوم بتغطي كل فلسطين. وين بده ياخذنا؟ على تل ابيب؟ ما احنا من اليوم الاول قصفنا تل ابيب، بده ياخذنا على الجليل. الجبهه الشماليه انفتحت اليوم مع لبنان، يعني ليست آمن الجليل الآن للعدو الصهيوني، ونحن قادرون أن نقصف الجليل من فلسطين المحتلة. لسرية المعركة ولنجاح ساعة الصفر ما كان حد يعرف من الفصائل، وحتى الحلفاء ما كانوا يعرفوا ساعة الصفر، لكن بعد نصف ساعة جرى اتصال مع كافة فصائل المقاومة الفلسطينية ومع حلفائنا في حزب الله في إيران، تم تبليغهم الأتراك، تم تبليغهم، صار لقاء معهم بعد 3 ساعات، يعني 9 صباحا، وكذلك كل من اتصل بنا وضعناه بالصورة. حتى الروس أرسلوا رسالة واستفسروا كذلك، تم وضعهم بالموقف وبأهداف المعركة.
في معتقلين فلسطينيين ايضا خارج اسرائيل في دول اوروبيه يمكن.
في معتقلين في امريكا
كمان
بدنا اياهم طبعا. في عندنا من حماس معتقلين في امريكا ومحكومين مؤبدات، كمان بدنا اياهم طبعا. نطالب امريكا ان تفرج عن ابنائنا اللي في سجونها، وامريكا عم بتعمل تبادل، عملت مع ايران قبل مده قريبه تبادل، ليش ما تعمل معنا تبادل؟ ما هي شريكي في هذه المعركه. اعلن بايدن، اعلى سلطه في امريكا، اعلن وقوفه مع اسرائيل ضد حماس، ضد الشعب الفلسطيني، لذلك هو شريك في العدوان، عليه ايضا ان يدفع الثمن. الاسرائيلي معروف عنه انه بحب الحياه.
Listen to this.
بنضحي، نعتبر انه قتلانا شهداء، فامنا يعني اهم امنيه عند اي واحد فلسطيني انه يستشهد في سبيل الله
يعني
دفاعا عن ارضه. ومحضرين حالنا، إلنا 2 عم نحضر ومنرتب وصنعنا كثير، وعندنا مصانع كل شيء. عندنا من صواريخ 250 كيلو ل 160 كيلو ل 80 كيلو ل 45 كيلو ل 10 كيلو. عندنا مصانع هاونات وقذائفها، مصانع بسفن وقذائفها، مصانع بيتن وقذائفها، مصانع كلاشينكوف ورصاصته. رصاصة كلاشينكوف عم نصنعها بالإذن من الروس، عم نصنعها في غزة. صرنا حلفائنا اليوم احنا اللي بدعمنا بالمال والسلاح بشكل رئيسي إيران، بتعطينا مال وسلاح، هذا أكيد. حزب الله، في عنا شعوب عربية وإسلامية واقفة معنا، في عنا دول تؤيدنا بالموقف السياسي. حتى الروسي اليوم متعاطف معنا، حتى الروسي يعني أرسل رسائل صباح أمس في تعاطف، ويعني سعيد أن تربك أمريكا في فلسطين. تعرف بتخفف عنه الضغط في أوكرانيا، لأنه معركة بتخفف عن معركة، فلذلك إحنا لسنا وحدنا في الميدان.
Okay, let's stop over here. What we're seeing is he's basically, telling the whole story. It's Russia and Iran that are backing Hamas. Russia gave Hamas a license to produce AK-47 guns and bullets in Gaza, while Gaza is under siege from the world, where they're only allowed in what will allow aid to the people. Russia has been allowing them to produce a very Russian, an AK-47, a very Russian gun and bullets, which use them. All of the attacks were carried out with Russian ammunition and with Iranian ones too. Let's return to the rest of the presentation. And so he says there very, very clearly, he says, Israelis love life. That's their problem. We're willing to go to great lengths to save even the life of one person, one hostage, to return even the body of soldiers in battlefield. And he says, all Palestinians are happy to die for the cause. Basically, he's holding 2.2 million Palestinians in Gaza, saying they're all willing to die and they're all happy to die. I beg to differ with him. I don't think that they do. But for so many Israelis, the idea that Hamas would be willing to do so was so heinous that we chose to kind of look away. We chose to forget what they wrote in their charter, which is exactly this. The attack was planned on a holiday. Simchat Torah took us by surprise. A lot of our forces were deployed elsewhere in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. And basically, this was our Yom Kippur. It was also planned for the day after, 50 years and 1 day, on the day after the great surprise of Yom Kippur. And they got us. Yeah, let's see the next one. Why this? Why now? Okay, he mentioned both Iran and Russia. He said both of our benefactors are Iran and Russia. And the idea that this happened without Iran knowing about it is preposterous. Iran is the backer, is the benefactor. The Wall Street Journal exposed that 500 of these terrorists trained in Iran in September for this attack. They got training in active war. They got weapons. They got the backing of Iran. And why is Iran poking the bear? Why is Iran looking at a war around here right now? Well, it's part of a larger picture. It has to do with the Abraham Accords of 2020, which Andrea can tell you all about because she visits the Gulf Emirates. She enjoys the fruits of this, where Arabs from around the world are no longer seeing Israel as an enemy, but as an ally, as a potential business partner, an ally to fight against Iran. Iran is the force that is destabilizing the region for centuries now. And as a result of that, Iran is viewing with great concern this rapprochement, or this coming together of the Arab world, the Sunni world, with Israel, the recognizing of Israel, and the rumors, or not even the rumors, the statements that have been coming out of Saudi Arabia under bin Salman and the Biden administration is that Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, which is the leader of the Arab world and the Muslim world, and America were on the verge of signing an agreement. And this agreement was first and foremost a financial one. It was a corridor, a gas line, a train, financial train from Saudi Arabia to India and from Saudi Arabia to Europe to take the strain off the Russian bear's grip on gas. No longer will the Europeans be dependent on Russians' gas. They can get it from Saudi Arabia, and along that train, along that gas line, will also be a peace train between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Saudi Arabia, the leader of the Muslim world, the place where almost every imam in the Sunni world today gets his training, will stop calling for the hadiths of the trees and the stones. It will take that out of the books. It's already out of the books, by the way, for the past 2 years. And it will start with different hadiths, which talk fondly of Jews, which describe how Muhammad married a Jewish girl and how Muhammad had ties with Jews. It's really a matter of what you choose to present. And the Arab world and the Sunni world is on the verge of normalizing with Israel. And to Iran, that is a huge threat. Saudi Arabia is its biggest enemy. America and Israel are also its biggest enemies. And a deal which will put together all of its enemies into one pact seemed as a catastrophe to Iran. And the Iranian Minister of Foreign Affairs said it's not going to happen. We're going to do everything we can to stop this. And this is how they stop it. They drag Israel into a war in Gaza, when the rest of the Arab world is now viewing Palestinian kids die in the streets. They go out on riots. And what's the first thing that happens? Saudi Arabia announces that the talks are now suspended. Russia enjoys this war too. Suddenly, everyone's not talking about Ukraine anymore. You notice how nobody's talking about Ukraine? It was on the news every day, all day. Russia's free to move into Ukraine with its Iranian drones. Iran is making drones in Moscow, in a big factory that they built there for attacks in Ukraine. And it's free to move forward with its heinous crimes there when the eyes of the world are now in Gaza, in what's going on over there, and the death count there, unfortunately. And so to the benefactor or the matchmaker of the massacre of October 7th is definitely Iran. Let's move over to the next one. These are Iran's proxy armies in the Middle East. So Yemen, Iraq, militias in Iraq that have been attacking American army bases, Syria, which by now is a non-viable state. It's mostly occupied by Iran, with displacement of Sunnis and Iranian Shiites that are moved into Syria to occupy it. Lebanon, which is a non-viable state by now, controlled mostly by Hezbollah, which is Iran's proxy army. And Morocco, did you know that? Well, there's a Moroccan front which Iran is backing. Iran is a chaos agent in the Middle East. It strives to undermine the Sunni majority, and it strives in every way possible to re-challenge the Arab world. Iran is a non-Arab. It's a Shiite Muslim country. This is an animosity that is as old as time and is reshaping the Middle East as we know it today. Let's see what the next one has in line for us. I'm going to start speeding through some of these. What next? The situation now, the biggest complication in it is the hostages. The Palestinians, the Hamasniks, kidnapped so many hostages and so many children because they're banking on the idea that Israel will never invade Gaza. From the very first day, they said, we have 250 hostages. Release everyone. Release all of the prisoners you have in Israeli prisons. We're talking about, thousands, tens of thousands of Palestinian prisoners, terrorists, some with real blood on their hands. And Hamas was banking on the fact that Israel will never dare invade Gaza with so many hostages held by them. It is embanked in underground cities, trenched in very well-built tunnels, and it has an endless supply of shells and rockets, which they are still firing, like I said, 2 hours ago until now. The aid agencies are powerless. The Red Cross, I don't know how much they're insisting. It's a good question, but they haven't seen our hostages yet. They're mostly covering the Palestinian suffering. Israel has advanced troops into Gaza after almost a 3-week waiting process and is now on the verge of taking over the entire northern part of the Gaza Strip, dislocating the north and the south, and completely circling the Gaza city, and has taken control of the El Shifa hospital. All the while, there's a very strong pressure of international programs, international regimes for a ceasefire which will allow the Hamas to regroup and move forward. Let's move on to the next one. I'm starting to speak faster. All this time, Gaza is being crunched by Israel after Israel has called for citizens to move out of the city of Gaza and the north of the Gaza Strip. 1.6 million of the 2.2 have moved out. Israel has said, move out, we will open corridors, we will make sure that your moving out will be secured by Israel, secured from Hamas, which has been shooting people in the streets as they try to get out of Gaza. But many, many civilians have lost their lives, especially in the first stage of attacking from the air. And all the while, the Hamas members are really not there. They're either dug under the El Shifa hospital in the underground city very comfortably, or they're in Turkey, or they're in Qatar. I'm not going to address any questions now. Andrea will give me a sign when the next stage is. Let's move on to the next one. Thank you. The Shifa hospital. This is footage released yesterday. It shows 2 hostages being dragged into the Shifa hospital. The video is unbelievable. You see doctors running around and people with AK-47s in the middle of the hospital, just dragging in Israeli hostages in a completely civilian hospital. Hamas is deliberately entrenching itself into the civilian population in schools and hospitals and ambulances, in refugee camps, so that Israel will find it harder. Here you see the Hamas actor. This is called the crisis actor of Hamas. Here he's crying with fake blood that Israel is firing inside the Shifa hospital. Not one shot was fired inside the hospital. The Israeli army has been going in very slowly into the hospital, all the while moving people out. Just today, it moved 39 babies in incubators to make sure that no civilians are harmed along the process. But it's a very, very delicate process. As Israel took control of the hospital, the bodies of 2 female hostages, a civilian and a soldier, Yehudit Weiss and Noama Tziona, who's a 19-year-old graduate of my daughter's school here in our little town of Modi'in, were discovered. They were both murdered as Israel advanced into the hospital. They were held there and they were murdered while their attackers disappeared into the underground tunnels. We've got a few more to go before the next stage. Friends and ally ships. And I put a picture of a ship, the biggest ship, really, the Eisenhower. The J. Ford. America showed up at this point when the situation was very, very fragile and the question of another front was on the table. And America showed up in more ways than one. And there's no words to the feeling Israelis feel right now towards America and towards American Jewry. For the literal standing with Israel, here are pictures. I'm assuming some of you might have had family members, some of you might have been there yourselves in that incredible display of the connection, of the ties between us, and standing up to anti-Semitism, which is poking its terrible, hideous head around America and around the world today. And here there's a cute graffiti of Joe Biden as a superhero with a one word. He had a message when he put that big pistol on the table and said, we're coming in with everything we have to stop this from escalating. I have one message for you if you're thinking of, escalating this even more. And the word was don't. Let's move on to the next few slides. This is meanwhile around the country. There's a limited attack in the north by Hezbollah, which, like I said, is Lebanese Iran war machine. They have not shown up for the cause. The Palestinians were banking on them to open a full-out front with the rockets that they have that can cover the country. They decided not to. Nasrallah came out on TV 2 weeks ago and said, I'm sorry, we're not going to engage against Israel at this point, which was seen by Palestinians as a huge stab in the back by Hamas. The Houthis have joined the party from Yemen by firing towards Iran. That's sustained with our long-range anti-ballistic missiles, the Arrow, which has proven extremely successful at this point. There's a lot of political instability in Israel. A lot of young men, not even young, between the ages of 20 and 50, and sometimes 60, are fighting, are drawn at the reserve. And so our entire economic and social system is under a lot of pressure right now. But we're also seeing unbelievable shows of display of unity in Israel, where everyone's helping everyone, where I'm picking clementines one day and cabbage the next. We're in the fields, we're helping mothers that are stuck at home with the kids, but their husband is deployed. We're doing their laundry, their food. I'm doing laundry for soldiers. I've become really good at folding underwear of soldiers. We're seeing, I mean, for the past 10 months, we've been ripping each other's heads off with these arguments about where Israel is going. And suddenly we're seeing this unbelievable amount of unity in Israel, which is something that needs to be addressed. Let's move over to the next one. Andrea, you'll give me a heads up when okay, I think it's after this one. The questions raised by, where are we going next with this? How do we minimize the loss of life of Palestinians and Israelis as we invade the most populated area in the world right now, with guerrilla warfare and an army that is out of ideology and opportunism, is fighting with human shields, literal children around them? What about the hostages? How do we do this? We've already lost a few hostages. What's happening right now in Egypt and Jordan, two countries with which we have a peace agreement, which are undergoing a lot of attacks against Israel, a lot of hate against Israel and the population there. The regimes are, trying to stick with us. Who will take over Gaza? I put a picture here of Mahmoud Abbas and Joe Biden. Mahmoud Abbas is seen as the most probable figure to take over Gaza in the day after Hamas. But that's a big question. Who will assure Israel's safety once Israel takes over Gaza and hopefully removes its forces? What happens to the 2 million people there? And how much will it cost, which is also a question of our economy. We estimate this war at $250 million. Sorry, $250 million shekels, 250 million shekels. That's about 60, 70 million dollars. That's a lot of money for Israel. It's a lot of money for any country. Are we taking questions now, or do we have one more?
How many more slides? Are we almost at the end?
We're almost
save some.
Almost at the end.
Let's finish and then we'll take the questions.
Okay.
Perfect.
The mood in Israel right now, it goes from unbelievable shock, pain, horror, and this sense of grieving, but we can't really grieve because there's so many people that are still there. Here's a display of the table with 250 seats on Shabbat evening of all those people we want to bring back. This is a picture I took on our street. Every person from my community, from Modi'in, who dies, who falls in battle, we've had quite a few. Whenever the procession towards the cemetery leaves the family's house, we march in the streets so that every street, every corner has people standing with flags to accompany the family between their home and the graveyard. And this is something that's been going on all over the country. We won't let anybody stay alone with their pain. The idea of don't panic. And also, this lady over here, Rachel from Ofakim, who managed to hold off 4 terrorists in her home by giving them cookies and tea and asking them how they're feeling until they were all taken out by the SWAT team, and she survived. And she's seen as the we can do it superpower, Israeli social power. Let's move over to the next one. We're seeing changes in our society. For the first time, it's not for the first time women have been in the battle, but it's the first time where we're actually hearing about unbelievable heroic heroines in the Israeli battlefields. And the question of how much should we incorporate women into our forces is now answered by as much as we can, because they're doing an awesome job and they should be allowed every opportunity men should. And so this is the civilian commander of the response team in Nir Am, which saved the entire kibbutz. By realizing what's happening and not waiting for orders, she deployed her entire response unit along the borders, the perimeter, and they stopped the attack before they actually came in. These are the fighters of the Caracal mission. We're also seeing ultra-Orthodox, another incredibly explosive political issue in Israel of how much ultra-Orthodox should take part. Ever since the event started, we've seen 1,500 ultra-Orthodox men who said, we can't sit aside while this happens. Enlist us. The son of Deri, Aryeh Deri, the political leader of Shas, went into the reserve unit. He never served in the IDF, but he says, I want to take whatever I can. The Zaka, the response, the identifying unit of the deceased, which is an unbelievably hard task at this point, are all Haredi people. And they're doing this out of a religious ideology of bringing every deceased person to a grave, no matter at which price, no matter how many hours and which horrible sights you need to endure to bring that person to a burial, to a proper Jewish burial. So we're seeing changes. I think this is our last slide coming up now. And like Andrea said, there are no real silver linings, but we are seeing grit. We're seeing the Israeli society, which our enemies thought now would be the time to strike them because they're so exhausted by their internal feuds, they're just going to collapse. Like the spider web, the famous spider web speech that Nasrallah himself gave a few years ago. He said it'll all come falling apart. But on the contrary, we're seeing ourselves stronger and more united than ever before. We're volunteering, we're holding it together, we're forming alliances. An Israeli, Arab, Bedouin, and Jewish war room in the south was established to distribute food and shelter and homes to anyone who was displaced, Jewish or Arab, from the south of Israel. And many Arabs were hit and displaced. There's a real sense of unity. People are getting married on the front lines because they don't want to hold it up. So I think you can call them shotgun weddings, but not in that sense. We're seeing a real unity and countless programs generated by civilians. Like I said, the draft and volunteer to the IDF exceeds 100%. So many people have signed up to be drafted that there's not enough ammunition or gear to give around for them. That's how good we're doing in that sense. And we're seeing an incredible American Jewry support. And this is, if there ever was a silver line to this, it's the sense that we're just the same people on two sides of the Atlantic. And we cannot thank you enough for your support through this in almost every way possible. I'm tearing just saying this. And this is my last slide for today. Yeah, this is me. This is me, and Andrea can share that with you later. And I'm happy to take questions now.
So I do want to just make sure that everyone knows they will receive the PowerPoint, and you will also receive the recording. So at your own leisure, you'll be able to listen and teach, because I know many of you want to share a lot of this with your friends and your family. So you'll have the opportunity to do that. We do have a few more questions. So I'm going to begin by the one we didn't speak about who's controlling the Rafah crossing with Egypt. What's happening there? I know we have a lot of questions about that. So if you could address that, would be great.
So on the Palestinian side, Hamas is controlling the Rafah border, and it's been closing it. It's been closing it to Americans who tried to get out, who were actually asked to get out by the UN and by the American regime, by the American establishment and State Department. On the Egyptian side, it's controlled by Egypt. Israel has no control over the Rafah crossing. This is important to acknowledge. It is an independent international border between Egypt and Palestine and Gaza.
Why won't Israel put in, how can Israel inform the world that Hamas is the enemy of the Palestinians and not Israel? Yes, I know, in 2 minutes. That's a big question, but it's the question Jewish people around the world actually are asking all the time.
I think on the one hand, we're doing a good job by asking Arabs, and they're happy to do that in Israel, to stand up. Many, many Arabs were killed on October 7th. Bedouin women in full hijab dress, in full Muslim, very, very modest dressing, were shot before the eyes of their children. So the fact that they're not only dangerous for, for their people, but they're dangerous for Islam also, for Muslims, for fellow Muslims, is one which a lot of people in Israel understand, a lot of Palestinians understand, and interestingly enough, the Arab world understands this. The fact that so many Arab countries are asking us to take out Hamas, they're doing it quietly, but they're definitely wanting for us to take out, is because they realize what a danger Hamas is to the Palestinian people and to the stability of the entire region, of the Arab states and the Muslim people. How do we get this message out? It's probably the best question right now. And one that I can't answer. I think we need to do a better job in getting our message out there. We need to tackle lack of nuance. I'm going to try to limit some of my criticism, but lack of nuance in colleges today. We need to tackle intersectionality and the way it's perceived as the weak is always right in this sense. And these are questions that we just, we have to get, we're going to need your help with this. We're going to need any help we can.
And I think you have that. There are approximately 2 million Palestinians in Israel who have the rights of citizens. Why isn't this being promoted? Similar question.
Yeah, so Israel is trying to promote that. Some of the voices on our social media today are Lucy Ayoub and Lucy Aharish and what's her name? Gadir Hani and Yosef Haddad, if you follow them. These are people who are openly talking about the fact that they would not live anywhere else because being who they are anywhere else would put them at peril. Being people of pride.
I want you to know that Yosef Haddad wrote that he used to call himself a Palestinian Israeli, but now he's an Israeli Palestinian.
And
both
so did
Lucy Aharish.
So did Nas Daily.
And Nas Daily. And Lucy Aharish and Yosef Haddad will be meeting in Israel in January, and that's a real treat to be able to meet them there and listen to them. How many miles of tunnels are there? I don't know if you can answer that.
So I've heard different estimations of this. I've heard it that just under the Shifa hospital, we're talking at about 50 kilometers of tunnels, just under the city of Gaza. It is estimated that there are over 100 kilometers all through the Gaza Strip. I'm reminding you the Gaza Strip is 40 kilometers from top to bottom. So it's we're talking of endless amounts of tunnels. Some of them crossed into Israel and Israel stopped them. Some of them crossed into Egypt. And most of them are now just everywhere under the Gaza. It's an entire city under the ground.
Right. Let's see. With such destruction happening in Gaza, are we creating a new generation of Hamas fighters from the young children witnessing this destruction and believing Israel is the perpetrator?
That's a really good question. Israel has refrained from advancing boots on the ground or widespread attacks towards Hamas. And in the past decade, ever since 2014, and some of it was the assumption that we don't want to create another generation that sees their home destroyed and hates us. And that led us to this point. There's definitely going to have to be a denazification of Gaza, in the sense that if we managed to do this in Germany in 1945 and denazify a country that went into the Holocaust, even after it was bombed, after Dresden and Klen, I'm reminding you of some of the things that happened in World War I in order to bring World War II to an end, including bombing of civilian populations. We will have to invest tremendously in Gaza. We will have to create hope for the people there. We will have to build them cities. We will have to build them hospitals. We will have to build them schools where they will be taught that there is hope in life and that their sole purpose in life is not to die as a martyr, like the words of Ali Taha we witnessed earlier, but to have a good future for themselves.
I'm going to ask a question. It's a tough question. Those of our Gen Xers who were just in the empowerment initiative we had for those people specifically. It was a wonderful course. We'll be doing it again. Can you address the issue of settlers attacking Palestinians in the West Bank? And what happens to them?
Yeah, I'll address it on two levels. On the one level, it's just terrible. There are people within the Israeli community, we used to call them, extreme fringe we're now seeing that while their numbers are small, their power is growing within the Israeli mainstream, within our political system. And some of them are taking advantage of this situation right now, of all eyes on Gaza, to promote their take on shaping the Palestinian, on shaping the areas of where they live in the settlements in the West Bank. You can see right through me. I am not a right-wing person. I am not a speaker for the settlements in the West Bank. And I find that this is a very challenging task, because while I talk about how the people living in the communities in the envelope are not settlers and are real peace-seeking people, the actions taken in the West Bank are dragging this whole discussion into an unnuanced and anti approach around the world. And so I think the American State Department has been very clear that these actions need to stop. I could not agree more. Israel needs to do more to prevent, not only because of the loss of life of Palestinians, but because we don't want to open another front in the West Bank. The last thing we want is an escalation which will lead to a full-out intifada against the Palestinian Authority.
You mentioned there has been a sort of stand down in the internal Israeli society in terms of the politics and the inter-party conflicts. Do you think there will be any longer term impact on the coalitions? Simple answer.
Another simple question. I said there's a stand down in the sense that Israelis are trying to put politics aside and just get through this war. It doesn't mean that politics has ceased. No. Politics, politicians are politicians, and they continue doing their politics all the while. And we are seeing voices that are calling for the removal of Bibi Netanyahu and the continuation of the same government, but with another leader from the Likud. We're seeing voices that are calling for, elections soon. We're definitely seeing, after the first shock and after the first 30, 40 days that were given, we're definitely seeing voices on both sides that are calling for a change right now. I don't think that this unity will continue much, much longer. To be honest, I think our biggest challenge right now is to be able to utilize the lessons of this massacre, of this event, into some form of agreement. Even agreeing to disagree, but doing so without saying, I cannot fathom how you can think that way. I cannot take that you think differently from me, which has been the source of a lot of our disagreements in the past, I would say year, but it's so much more than a year. The fact that our political system is so polarized, and that if you don't think like me, then I cannot even imagine sitting around and having coffee with you, is something which will have to change. We're gonna have to figure out how to do this.
I think we still have a couple more minutes. So do you think the US will supply Israel with bunker buster bombs like those that have been discussed to target the Iranian underground nuclear plants?
Do I think so? Yes. Do I hope so? Yes. Do I know anything about that? Not at this point. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. I think we're pretty much, I think that one of the questions we didn't get to earlier that I'd like to ask you now. Do you know why Israel isn't using the David sling, the laser, to stop terrorist rockets? Have you read anything? Do you know anything about that?
The David sling is not operational. We're talking somewhere between 12 and 18 months until it is fully operational. We're using, and the David sling is for very long range, for medium range rockets. So we're using something called the Arrow, which is the long intergalactic, the long ballistic missiles. That's what's been used against the rockets fired from Yemen, which are quite long ranged and with great success until now. And we're using the Iron Dome, which is proven effective, albeit expensive. Every rocket is somewhere between $30,000 and $50,000. I don't remember the last estimate on that. Once the laser is operable, it'll be able to tackle a few rockets at the same time, and it'll be a fraction of the cost.
Okay, so just a clarification question. There are a few people asking us about the Gaza envelope. If you could define the envelope, that would be great.
Great.
Thanks.
The envelope are a series of communities. I wish I had a map for that right now, which have been in the Gaza area along the borders there, some as early as 1939, 1941, 1945, Be'eri and Kfar Aza are some of the older ones, and have been living, most of them are kibbutzim, but some of them are moshavim, which is a slightly different way of an agricultural community, which is not collective. Well, not much is collective anymore in the sense of a socialism. But many of them were shaped by socialism. Many of them were shaped by the ideology that where we put our people in the 30s and the 40s is where eventually our borders will be defined. That's how the state of Israel came to be. There were never enough soldiers to, to march the lands, but there were lands bought, settled, and eventually the lines of the land in partition plan and the war later would be followed according to the population where they settled. And the Gaza envelope have been living under a lot of the fear of Gaza in the 50s and the 60s, like I said, before Israel took over Gaza, and then in the fear of the rockets ever since. In September, I visited Kfar Aza with a group of the Congressional Black Caucus, led by Lucy Macbeth and Richie Torres, amazing representatives, Democrats, super pro-Israel. And we visited the house of Chen Avrams. Her house was invaded. She wasn't home on the events of the massacre. And she said, the rockets are terrible. We have a whole generation of post-traumatics here. She has a whole display cabinet full of rocket pieces. But with the Iron Dome, it's a life that we can live. And she says, it's heaven. The kids walk around freely. It's paradise. That's how she described living. She said, we have the fence, we have the border, we have a lot of protection, we feel safe. That was the conception or the misconception, that we can rely on technology, we can rely on the Iron Dome, we can rely on the defense systems along our border, the cameras, the shooting guns that identify movement and shoot without even a person. And eventually all of that tech industry collapsed when 3,000, attackers came at once from 30 different points.
So there is one more question I wanted to address, but before I address the question, I'd like to share my screen. You'll let me know when you guys see it. Let's see, share screen. It's not sharing, there we go. Okay, so you can see what's on my screen right now. The last question was, what is Israel, other than donating, what else can Americans do to help? So you may have another answer to this, but I know one of the things we've all been doing incredibly well is supporting Israel in every single way that we can. And another way that we're seeing now is Americans and Canadians. I know there's a massive Canadian group there now. And we, along with other people, are having our mission. And all of you who are listening today will, if you haven't seen this already, in the next few days, you'll learn more. We are going to Israel January 11th to the 16th, and we will be meeting some of the people that Daniella shared. We have our goals and objectives while we're there, which will be to volunteer, to meet with Israeli TV presenters and social media influencers, to meet with families, evacuees, and shop, eat, and support local businesses and people. We work with people in Israel on a regular basis who are in the Gaza envelope, by the way, as we speak. Their wives and their families are at home, and they are depending on all of us for support. And so I'm going to end the session today right here, right on time at 11:30. And I just want to thank you on behalf of Melton for not what you do just in the field with us, but for today. I think you did an incredible job helping us lay it all out so clearly. And in the chat, which we'll share with you, Daniella, you have received so many compliments. And so I know that people are nodding. I only have a few people, but they're all nodding in agreement with me. And so I just want to thank you on behalf of all of us. And I want to thank all of you. And I'm going to turn over to Adi for closing comments and whatever Adi has to share with us. That we've taken our time. I'm leaving it up to you now to close us out.
I don't have anything. I just want to say thank you, Daniela. I mean, that was a really spectacular and informative presentation. I'm so glad that it's able to reach so many people. We have so many people with us live here and so many people who are going to get this recording. So I don't have anything to say beyond thank you. And I'm really glad that we were able to offer this. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm going to shut this Zoom down. We'll see you all in another Melton program, I hope. And Daniela, right back at you, same thing. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.